Good morning, everyone. So, this week we are kind of taking stock of where we are. We are looking at what North America, colonial North America, looks like by around the mid part of the 18th century. So we're going to start off today talking about some of the kind of larger, broader demographic trends that are happening in the colonies. We'll then get into looking at the political culture that is developing, the political and economic culture that's developing in the colonies during this period. And finally, by the end, we will talk about the origins of a war, the 7 Years' War, commonly known in the United States as the French and Indian War, and how that war sort of breaks out. And this is going to lead us into talking about the American Revolution, which we'll get into next week. So, to start us off, as I mentioned, I want to talk a little bit about the kind of demographic changes and where the colonies are at by the year around 1750 or so. So, all of the colonies, as we've seen, we've explored the setup of, most of the colonial regions in North America that were settled by the British. All the colonies faced an early struggle to survive. Between about 1700 and 1750, the colonial population rose from around 250,000 to over 2 million. And a lot of this growth was through natural increase, meaning that people were having more children. Uh, and there was also a large influx of non-English Europeans coming to the British colonies during this era as well. There are distinct regional differences, as we've seen, between the different colonial regions, and these differences intensified and persisted throughout the colonial period. So the frontier of the colonies ran for about 800 miles along the Appalachian Mountain Range from western Pennsylvania in the north to western Georgia in the south. And the frontier was a really complex and fluid and violent mixture of Europeans, Native Americans, and enslaved people of African heritage. So it's a very diverse place. And there is a lot of diversity in the colonies as well. We can see that in some of these tables here. So this table here at the bottom with the numbers on it, that tells us what were the main ethnic or national groups coming to the American colonies between 1700 and 1775. And I want you to look at this table and think about what you notice about the figures in this table and what it tells us about society in the colonies in the first half of the 18th century. The first thing that really sticks out in this table is that the vast majority, the majority of migrants coming to the British North American colonies during this period did not come here willingly. They were enslaved people brought here from Africa. As you can see, the single largest group of all of these colonies were enslaved. And then we have many people coming over from countries other than England. We have people coming over from Ireland, people coming from Germany, from Scotland, and then other European countries as well. And you can see, if we look at their status, the vast majority of them came over as free persons. There were about 151,600 free persons coming to the colonies during this period. About little over 100,000 indentured servants. Around 52,000 convicts were brought here. Again, sort of not necessarily by their own choice. But then 278,000, almost 278,500 people who were brought over as enslaved persons. Now, the other table here, the other map we have, is showing the ethnic diversity on the Atlantic coast of North America in about 1760 or so. So you can see where these different groups congregated. There is along the whole coastline a large majority of English colonists, and then there are small pockets of French, German, uh, you can see, interestingly enough, we have sort of a large concentration of Scotch-Irish or Highland Scots, concentrated in kind of the more Appalachian regions, the hilly regions in the interior along the frontier. And then you have, sort of the African population tends to be concentrated, especially in places like Georgia and South Carolina, along the coastline and around the coastal sort of regions. So this kind of gives you an idea of what the colonies really looked like in terms of who was populating the colonies and where they were settling. So England, in the late 17th and early 18th century, England had begun fighting with France. There was a kind of, relatively bloodless coup that took place in the late 17th century. The King William of Orange basically came over and overthrew the current King of England, James II, who was Catholic. William of Orange was Protestant. So we're still kind of fighting the battles of the Protestant Reformation here. And that sort of caused a lot of tension with France because France was a Catholic country. England had been ruled by a Catholic monarch, but had been now overthrown by a Protestant monarch. And now that sort of caused a lot of tensions with France. And so England was at war with France throughout much of the late 17th and into the early 18th century. These wars were of unprecedented scale and cost to compete with France, which at that time was the most powerful kingdom in Europe. The English had to build a much larger and more professional military, the army and the navy especially. That military had to be maintained by a increasingly large state bureaucracy, and it had to be funded. These wars cost money, after all. It had to be funded by higher levels of taxation. So essentially, during this era, England becomes a fiscal military state, which is really dominated by the task of waging war, particularly war against the French. So first, the English fight a war called the 9 Years' War, which goes from 1689 to 1697, to essentially uphold this new Protestant regime, maintain England's hold over Ireland, and preserve their American colonies and defend their new allies, the Dutch, from a massive French invasion. Then there was a period of peace for about 5 years until 1702. When, to defend both the Protestant succession and the European balance of power, England again fights the French in a war called the War of the Spanish Succession. This conflict lasted until 1713. Both of these wars proved to be inconclusive in terms of deciding whether it was the French or whether it would be the English who would be the supreme imperial power in Europe. That's essentially what they're fighting over. Who's going to be the main big power? Is it going to be the French or the English? And this question was not really settled, but gradually through these wars, English power was gradually strengthening. It was also during this period that England united with Scotland to form Great Britain. Not, sort of necessarily willingly united with Scotland. The Scottish were not terribly happy about that whole idea. The British Empire was also able, by the 1730s, to get rid of piracy in the West Indies. This is exactly the period where, if you've ever seen the movie Pirates of the Caribbean, this is exactly what was happening with the British in the Caribbean at this point. So the British are kind of eliminating piracy in the Caribbean. So these triumphs in war, in crafting Great Britain itself as a political entity, and in crushing the pirates, this marked a revolutionary transformation in the power of the British realm. The British were able to build up their power at the expense of both the French and the Dutch. During the early 18th century, London became Europe's premier center for commerce and high finance, whereas before it had been Amsterdam in the Netherlands. Now that power is shifting to London. None of this had come cheap. The British had a massive national debt, and to pay for the expansion of the army and especially the navy, the British became the preeminent naval power during this period. The crown had to levy taxes, particularly on commerce. And as commerce became fundamental to British power, the American colonies became more and more important to the empire. Overseas commerce and naval warfare also became central to the 18th century patriotism of the British Empire. The English united against the French, and the American colonists definitely participated in this struggle against the French, and they felt strongly tied to their mother country. So the American colonies become tied with the British by trade and warfare with France. While all of this is also going on, during the 18th century, the expanding transatlantic commerce produces a consumer revolution that meant that people in the colonies had enjoyed much cheaper and much more diverse goods than they ever had before, greater abundance of goods than they ever had before, and more common people could become consumers. The American colonists were consuming the products produced throughout the British Empire, other locations within this vast British imperial system. Tea and spices from India, and sugar from the West Indies, and British manufactured goods. Consumer goods became more conspicuous as well, thanks to the proliferation of colonial stores. They would display all of these goods in the windows, and newspapers would advertise the latest goods being imported into the colonists. And then even if you didn't live in one of the colonial cities, you could still participate in this consumer economy because peddlers would bring goods into the rural towns and into the frontier settlements. We tend to kind of like to romanticize colonial America as a place where all of these self-sufficient yeoman farmers were able to produce everything that they needed. This was never really the case. No farm could produce everything that a household needed. And merely getting by, merely subsisting, did not satisfy the desires of the colonists or limit the production of the colonists. Every colonial farm produced crops, both for the needs of the immediate household, but also to be sold on the market. The colonists needed to sell their produce so that they could purchase consumer goods that they couldn't make themselves. Things like sugar, tea, metal tools, luxury goods like cups and saucers, buttons, buckles, silverware. All of these things were sort of a way to elevate one's status in society. Colonial societies were very new and they were very fluid. And so being able to display consumer goods meant that you could sort of move up in your status. The wealthier colonists tried in all the ways that they could to emulate the gentry back at home in England. They cultivated this idea of gentility, where they sort of adopted this very conspicuous, self-conscious consuming style that emphasized being, sort of very, living in these very sort of refined houses, wearing these very refined clothes, the houses tended to be, the houses of the wealthiest colonists tended to be built out of brick and filled with fine furniture that had been imported from England or from France. Ordinary people who didn't have a lot of wealth, they continued to live in smaller, more traditional houses built out of wood or even log cabins kind of thing. But they began to fill those houses with some of the consumer goods that could be associated with the new mansions. The sort of upper class began to look down upon common farmers and artisans, but common people strove as consumers to erase this line between being part of the gentility and being just a commoner. So there's this whole competition for status going on. And the way that you sort of compete is to consume and to buy consumer goods. This drove both common people and the wealthy elite to buy more than they could afford. And because the colonies imported more than they produced, there was this chronic trade imbalance. And most colonists went into debt to compete for this social status. So personal debt started going up and up and up during this period. As colonial society matured, you start to see different social classes emerging. As we've talked about just a second ago, the elite in the colonists were not as wealthy or as powerful as the European aristocracy, but they gradually come to dominate colonial society and politics. In the New England area, in the middle colonies, people who were members of the elite tended to be wealthy merchants. In the southern colonies, the elite were the wealthy enslavers and plantation owners. Of course, there's no titled aristocracy, so they can't claim, nobody in the colonies can claim to be a lord or an earl or a count or anything like that. But these men of prominence were also in control of colonial government, so they were the, preeminent part of society. And especially in the South, wealthy families were very closely connected with each other, and they were in complete control of the local and colonial government. Colonial elites really tried, as I said, to model their lives on British etiquette and behavior. They tried to emulate the English aristocracy in every single way, except for the fact that they could not claim a landed title. So you couldn't claim to be an earl or a duke or anything like that. But for them, society was definitely hierarchical, and they were on the top of the pyramid. They are the ones who have the wealth. They are the ones who have the prominence. And they believed that this meant they have every right to dominate the other social classes. And I think in part because the elite dominated social and political life in the colonies so much, and they felt such strong ties, cultural ties, economic ties to Britain, the overall culture of the colonies tended to be affected very strongly by this. Now, at the other end of the spectrum are the poor. Both enslaved people and also free people who are, at the bottom of the pyramid. Enslaved people, of course, live in extreme poverty. Free colonists who were at this, at this level in society also increased as land started to become scarcer. That forced those who could not buy land or could not own property to try to find work in the cities or in other colonies. So by about 1750, about half of the wealth in the colonies was concentrated in the hands of the richest 10% of the population. So it's a very stratified society. Now, the vast majority of the colonists were neither very, very wealthy or extremely poor. Most people were small farmers who owned their own land or artisans who owned their own shop. And as a result of this, land ownership became a very powerful indicator of personal freedom for a lot of colonists. One historian has put it this way. He said, a dislike of personal dependence and an understanding of freedom as not relying on others for their livelihood sank deep roots in British North America. And you want to keep that idea in mind as we go forward, because it's going to be a very powerful idea that dominates American political culture, really up into the 19th century. Now, as we talked about, colonial governments were dominated by the wealthy elites, but in general, things were a bit more democratic in the colonies than they were in England, mainly just due to the fact that there is a lot more available land in the colonies, and so more people could own property and thus have the right to vote. Somewhere between 50 to 80% of adult white men could vote in 18th century America. And that was as opposed to about 5%, less than 5%, in fact, in Britain. But we have to keep in mind that voting everywhere in the colonies was restricted. It was restricted by sex. Only men could vote. By religion. In some places, certain religious groups were prohibited from voting. By race. In the 18th century, free property-owning people of color ended up losing the right to vote in some of the southern colonies. And in the northern colonies, local custom restricted voting rights on the basis of race. Native Americans, in general, could not vote. Political leaders, whether elected or appointed, were generally not very closely connected with their constituents. Governors, colonial councils, these were not elected offices. They were appointed by the crown or by the colonial proprietor. Laws that were passed by colonial assemblies could be vetoed by the governor or by the English government. Outside of New England, local officials, too, were appointed by the governor. And you had to have very high qualifications to hold office in terms of owning property. For example, in order to sit in the colonial assembly in South Carolina, you had to have at least 500 acres of land and 10 slaves, or own property worth 1,000 pounds. Now, obviously, this led to colonial governments being dominated by wealthy landowners or merchants. And there's a strong culture of deference in some colonies where it's just assumed to be the natural order of things that wealth and education and social prominence meant that you had this automatic right to hold public office. In the first half of the 18th century, the British government is preoccupied with fighting all these wars against France and establishing its empire, and so it's not paying a lot of attention to what's going on in the colonies. It largely left the colonies to govern themselves. This resulted in colonial assemblies becoming more and more powerful. The leaders of these assemblies saw their role as almost similar to that of the British Parliament. They were very heavily influenced by ideas of republicanism and liberalism. And I'm going to talk about what those terms mean in just a minute. They believed firmly that they were Englishmen and they had the same rights as Englishmen back in England. The colonies also developed a very robust, quote-unquote, public sphere. Public sphere basically just means political organization and debate outside of the government, where informed citizens, literate citizens, talked about political philosophy and ideas and the great questions of the day. In the major cities like Boston and New York and Philadelphia, clubs sprang up where issues about literature and science and philosophy and politics were discussed by the elite. But it's not just the elite talking about these ideas. Conversations were also happening in taverns and inns and coffee houses. The public sphere in the colonies was supported by a very literate population. Colonial America was probably the most literate society in the world in the 18th century. And by a very strong press, which I'm going to talk about in just a minute, which printed newspapers and broadsides and pamphlets to circulate news and ideas throughout the colonies. a lot of the ideas that were spreading throughout the colonies had their root in the European Enlightenment. This was a philosophical movement that began in France and had spread to England, and Enlightenment thinkers sought to apply the principles of the scientific revolution, the scientific method, research, experimentation. They thought that those principles could be applied to political life and social life. They believed that reason, not religion, should govern human society. And these ideas would prove to be enormously influential in the colonies, and they were adopted and refined by colonial leaders like Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson. So we've talked about how by the 18th century, Britain is the greatest naval and commercial power in the world. And this was something that British subjects on both sides of the Atlantic took a lot of pride in. They also believed that Britain's system of government, where you had a very powerful, you had a king, but you also had a very powerful parliament, they believed that this was the superior form of government. The concept of liberty was very central to British identity during this period. Power and liberty, 18th century Britons believed, were naturally opposing forces. Power and liberty are naturally opposed to each other. And between power and liberty lies the rule of law, the right to be represented in your government, individual rights in common law, and checks on absolute power. These ideas were very, very powerful, and they permeated all of British society. Now remember, I mentioned two isms just a minute ago, republicanism and liberalism. The first thing that you need to know about these terms is that they don't really have anything to do with their current meanings in our society today. So republicanism, with a small r, has nothing to do with the current Republican Party. And the 18th century idea of liberalism has nothing to do with our current understanding of the word liberal. So when you see these words, don't automatically assume that they mean the same thing in history that they do today. This is one of those times where we have to set aside our modern worldviews and remember that the meaning of words in the past is different from the present. All right, so what is republicanism? Republicanism, just very briefly, is the idea that virtuous, economically independent citizens should play an active role in public life. And this is what is going to prevent political tyranny. Now, virtue, in this sense, meant not just simply a person's personal morality, but the willingness to set aside one's own private self-interest for the common good. So the thinking here was that a citizen could only be virtuous if he, and in the 18th century it was always he, was economically independent, which in practical terms then was almost synonymous with owning land or some kind of property. You could not be a virtuous citizen if you were dependent on your livelihood for someone else. So then we have liberalism, which is sort of the kind of, other half of this Enlightenment political philosophy that's really popular in Britain and the colonies during this period. Liberalism is the idea that all individuals have natural rights that no government should violate. The leading philosopher of this idea of liberalism was a man named John Locke, and you can see him here. He wrote an influential book called The Two Treatises of Government in 1860. Locke believed in the idea of the social contract. He wasn't the originator of that idea, but he very strongly believed in the idea that government is formed by a mutual agreement among equals. who, of course, in the 18th century are all male heads of household. The purpose of government, according to Locke, was to protect the life, liberty, and property of these individuals. And if the government did not do these things, Locke wrote, individuals had the right to rise up and overthrow that government and establish a new government that would protect people's natural rights. So according to this philosophy, protecting life, liberty, and property required that a person's private life and their personal concerns should not be interfered with by the state. The government should stay out of your individual private business. These two ideas, republicanism and liberalism, worked together. They have some common threads. Both of these ideas inspired a commitment to a constitutional government and restraints on the power of the state. The state was limited in the power that it could exercise. And both emphasized property as the foundation of freedom. And both of these philosophies gained a strong foothold in 18th century America. They gain a strong foothold in part through the publication of newspapers, through the media in colonial America. Now here at the top, we have a picture of Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin was enormously important to the growth of the colonial media. When Benjamin Franklin was 12 years old, he had become an apprentice to his brother James, who was a printer. And this picture down here shows what a colonial print shop might have looked like. You've got, Benjamin Franklin. Imagine him as the younger guy there who is setting the type, and his older brother James is operating the press. James founded a newspaper called the New England Courant, the first truly independent newspaper in the colonies, and he taught his younger brother how to become a printer. Benjamin, however, did not really like working for his brother. They didn't get along very well, and so when he was 17, he runs away. He goes to Philadelphia. In 1728, Ben sets up a printing house, and he begins publishing his own newspaper called the Pennsylvania Gazette. And in addition to printing his newspaper, he printed books as well, both books that were written by other people, but also his own books. He began to publish a famous book called Poor Richard's Almanac in 1733. This was the colonial equivalent of a bestseller. He sold about 10,000 copies of the almanac every year, which is equivalent to about maybe 3 million today. People from all throughout colonial America read Franklin's writings. In addition, he also comes up with the idea of a circulating library where people could check out books. So through his newspaper, through his printing and publishing and his library, Benjamin Franklin was really enormously important for the spread of ideas throughout the colonies, ideas like republicanism and liberalism. He was also really influential in another way. In 1753, he was appointed by the British government as the Postmaster General for the colonies. That meant that he was in charge of the postal system for all of British North America. And he introduced a lot of reforms to the colonial postal service. He established new routes. He increased the frequency of the delivery of mail. He made it possible for postal carriers to carry newspapers between the colonies. And this is very important because now someone in South Carolina can read the same news, the same article as someone living in New Hampshire. So again, this helps to kind of bring the colonies together. By 1763, 23 different newspapers, like this one you see here, the Boston Newsletter on the right, were circulating throughout the colonies. These newspapers were not like the newspapers that you see today. They were only a few pages long, and they were published maybe once or twice a week. But they get passed around. They get passed from hand to hand. Sometimes they get read aloud in taverns or coffee houses. So the contents of these papers probably reached many more people. Most households in towns and probably even a lot of farms in the countryside had access one way or another to the material being printed in these newspapers. Now, colonial newspapers were modeled on the newspapers of England, and they often contained reprinted articles that were telling us about what's going on back in England. So because of this, the colonists were able to keep updated on all of what's going on back home. And this was a period where there was a lot of political turmoil going on in Britain. There's this huge battle going on there between two factions, two groups, the Tories and the Whigs. The Tories were royalists. They insisted the king had absolute power and he can do whatever he wants, whether or not Parliament agrees to it. They emphasized the supremacy of the Church of England. They spied on and prosecuted anybody who criticized the government. On the other side are the Whigs. The Whigs opposed the Tories. They argued for civil rights, religious freedom, and the supremacy of Parliament over the king. They also espoused a lot of these ideas of republicanism and liberalism that I've been talking about. The colonists in America were reading all about all of this in their newspapers, and they found all this turmoil very, very troubling. So we're beginning here to explore some of the factors that led to the American Revolution. To sort of get into that, we're going to have to talk, though, about a different war. A war called the 7 Years' War, or as it's more commonly known in the United States, the French and Indian War. This name, French and Indian War, is a bit misleading. It's not a war between the French and the Indians, but rather it's a war between the French and the British, with their Indian allies fighting on either side. And it's a much larger conflict than we tend to think of here in the United States. The 7 Years' War was really a global war. Some have even referred to it as the First World War. It was a war fought between the French and the British for predominance in Europe, for mastery over North America, and for control over global shipping and trade. Now, as I mentioned, the British and the French had been fighting for a number of years prior to the outbreak of the 7 Years' War, the 9 Years' War, the War of the Spanish Succession. These two wars were very costly and exhausting and inconclusive. So the British and the French in 1713, they called a truce, and they avoided going to war with each other again for another about 26 years. Then in 1739, Britain goes to war with Spain, and a little bit later, in 1754, the French are drawn into that fight, and that lasts from 1754 to about 1763. So maybe we should call it the 6 or the 8 Years' War. It's a little bit, inconclusive why it's called the 7 Years' War. And it's during this second cycle of warfare that the North American colonies become essential to the conflict. What this was all about? Well, essentially, the British decided they were going to expand their empire deep into North America. And to do that, they had to drive the French out. In North America, fighting began between the French and the British in 1754, and it ended in 1760. In Europe, the span between the official declaration of war was 1755 to 1763. For Native Americans, it's really hard to say when this conflict began or when it ended. One Native American leader described the war as gloomy and dark days that proceeded from the earth. And there were a lot of victims of the 7 Years' War. It was a very bloody conflict, and it really became, sort of this extremely devastating war for a lot of people. So how does this conflict start? It starts in a particular place. It starts in the Ohio River Valley. There was no clear dividing line that separated New France, the French holdings in North America, from the British colonies. So there were constant disagreements about who had claim to which land. And specifically, the region around the Ohio River Valley, into the Ohio River, up near the Great Lakes, was the kind of center of this conflict. France, who first discovered the Ohio country, they claimed control over it because they had not only arrived in that area first, but they had established trading centers there that ensured that they would have a lasting hold on that region. In contradiction, Great Britain claimed ownership because the land grants that had been issued by the British monarchy a lot of the colonies with claims to all areas expanding from the East Coast to the not yet settled West Coast. So there's no specific border here, and British colonists who are unhappy with all of the, lack of land on the East Coast, it's becoming increasingly overcrowded. They start expanding their settlements into French lands. They're taking over already established areas for their own specific use. And the French and a lot of their Native American allies are getting really frustrated with what the British are trying to do. So there's this rival claims for territory along the Ohio River. This kind of comes into a climax by about 1750. In 1748, a group of prominent Englishmen and Virginian colonists, they sort of look to this region, around the Ohio River, right around sort of this area right here. This sort of fork area where you've got, kind of three different rivers coming together. They see this as prime real estate. And so they organize a company and they obtain a large grant of about 200,000 acres in the upper Ohio River Valley. And so they plan to start settlements there and kind of, create a road. Meanwhile, the French, they consider this region to be a vital link between New France up in Canada and Louisiana, which is their sort of lower territories. So they claim the Ohio River Valley for France. In 1753, Governor Robert Dinwiddie of Virginia, he learned that the French had built a fort near Lake Erie and had built a fort in part of the Ohio country that was claimed by Virginia. So he sends out an expedition of about 8 men under the leadership of a young colonial military volunteer named George Washington to warn the French to withdraw. Washington sort of makes this journey as a British emissary in the midwinter of about 1753 to 1754. He was about 21 years old at the time, so not much older than you guys. The French, he goes to the French, he asks them, hey, maybe you want to, kind of get out of this area. We're kind of, interested in settling here. The French officers politely tell Washington that, no, we're going to stay. So he goes back to Virginia and he informs the governor that the French refuse to leave. Even before he learned of the French refusal to abandon the Ohio Valley, the governor sent a small force of soldiers to build a fort at the forks of the Ohio, right about where the city of Pittsburgh currently is. In April of 1754, this fort is barely finished when the French come in and they drive off the Virginians and they build a larger fort on this site. They call it Fort Duquesne. That same month, George Washington, who has risen up the ranks, now he's a lieutenant colonel, he starts westward from Alexandria with a newly recruited regiment of Virginians. They are supposed to build a road going along the Monongahela River. And he's sent there to help defend the English fort on the Ohio. When he reaches close to this region, he learns that the French have come in and they've built their big fort there. So he resolves to push on. And he comes to an area by around May of 1754. He comes to this area, a large kind of natural clearing known as the Great Meadows. He makes camp there. And pretty soon after he arrives, he receives word that there's a party of French soldiers camped in a ravine not far away. So on the night of May 27th, 1754, Washington and about 40 of his men go out in the night to confront the French and to try to find out, okay, well, what are they intending to do here? So they travel through the woods in the dark. They're trying to figure out where they're going. They can't even find the trail. About dawn, Washington meets up with a friendly Native American chieftain of the Seneca, known to the British as the Half-King. He's called the Half-King because he's not really a king necessarily of his people. He only has kind of, halfway authority. And they make plans to contact this French force. So they surrounded the French, and then a shot rings out. No one really knows, who fired. And pretty soon, there's just shooting all over the place. There's a skirmish. When it is over, about 13 Frenchmen are dead and 21 of them are captured. The French survivors claim that they had been attacked without cause by Washington. Their commander, a young French officer named Joseph Coulon de Villiers de Jumonville, he had been wounded in the conflict, and he says, "No, why did you attack us? We were on a diplomatic mission." Washington did not speak French, and so he couldn't really understand what they were telling him. And it seems like the Native American, the Seneca chief, who he has sort of allied himself with, has this really intense personal hatred of the French, stemming from his earlier experiences in the war. He steps in and he ends up killing de Jumonville, striking him over the head with his tomahawk. According to the account of one of the British, he comes up to Jumonville and he says in French, "Thou art not yet dead, my father," before striking with his weapon. Essentially, he basically said he was taking revenge against the French for having killed his father. After there's this skirmish, Washington tries to fortify his position. He builds a fort in the Great Meadows, which he calls Fort Necessity. And on the morning of July 3rd, 1754, a force of about 600 French and about 100 Native Americans comes to the fort. They attack it. It's raining and, the ground is marshy. All of their powder gets wet. Both sides suffered casualties. The British losses were much greater than the French and Indian losses. Eventually, Washington has to surrender. They write down a set of terms that they, sort of get Washington to sign. And Washington doesn't know French, so he's really not, kind of aware exactly what he's signing. One of the clauses in the treaty basically said that Washington had been guilty of assassinating this French officer, Jumonville. He said, he didn't understand what he was signing. In any event, the French used this to discredit the English. The British troops left their fort. They march back to Virginia, and the French burn the British fort, and they afterwards go back to Fort Duquesne. Now, how does this all sort of lead to war? Once he hears that Washington has been defeated, the governor of Virginia immediately sends this news to his superiors in London. He starts calling up other colonies to send them aid. The British Prime Minister says, "We got to strike now before, the French can reinforce their troops." So King George approves a plan to send General Edward Braddock to quickly seize French frontier forts. And basically, a lot of members of the British government had been itching to go to war against the French, and so they basically say, "Yeah, let's go in." Once they announce these public plans, the French government starts to dispatch reinforcements to North America. So military forces are massing on both sides. Pretty quickly, this conflict escalates into a full-blown war. I'll talk more about the 7 Years' War a little bit later this week, but basically that is kind of how it begins. So just to kind of advance and talk for a minute about what you should get done before coming to class on October 2nd, make sure that you've read Chapter 4 in your Going to the Source book. For those of you in my online course, make sure that you read Chapter 4 to prepare for this week's discussion. And I will see everybody later this week. If you have any questions, any concerns, just get in touch with me via email or after class or posting in the discussion forum. And have a great week, everybody. See you soon.